Coin-Op Corner has been following my life around for a couple of years now. It's neat to look back, not just at my old projects, but at the different stages of my life that each project took place in. Like back when I repaired machines in my kitchen for the arcade business I was running at the time, or when I moved to Kentucky and experienced my first snowstorm. And, most importantly, the time I included this spoof my friends sent me to use it as an excuse to talk to this beautiful lady right here. Now, that beautiful lady is my wife, and we're expecting. So my focus is going to shift away from my hobbies and onto my family. By and large, all that free time and disposable income that made the previous episodes possible is gone. So maintaining a fleet of volatile monitors and game PCBs is not something I can realistically do anymore. At least, not on this scale. So I decided to pare everything down to a more sustainable level by dumping my House of the Dead cabinet, since it died again, and swapping my original Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man, and Galaga machines for a Class of 81 machine. But then I thought it'd actually be neater to just put Class of 81 in my original Galaga cabinet, since I've already done all the work I need to on it, and the Class of 81 cabinets kinda suck. The main things I'm going to have to do are remove the original Galaga hardware, rewire the cabinet to connect to the new game PCB, and replace the control panel, since the existing control panel only supports a 2-way joystick, and I'll need a 4-way joystick for the Pac-Man games. I started by removing all of the low voltage wiring and the low voltage transformer from the cabinet, since I won't be needing them for the new board. I only need to leave behind the 120 volts going in, the isolation transformer, and all the associated fuses. After that, it was time to mount the new circuit board in the cabinet. From then on, it was a slow process of routing each wire to the corresponding component. Right off the bat, I ran into an issue connecting to the G07 monitor. The harness that I bought came with this weird video connector that I haven't seen used on any of my arcade machines before, so I had to replace it. I thought about cutting the connector out of the old Galaga harness, but it turns out that I had a connector with the same pin spacing in my box of spares, so I just cut it down to size and connected the wires accordingly. But once I was done, I ran into a problem. Nothing was getting power. After searching through the wiring diagram for Galaga, I realized that when I had removed the low voltage transformer, I had also removed the isolation transformer's connection to hot, since it shares its connection to hot with the low voltage transformer. So it was just a matter of reconnecting my transformer to hot, and now we've got power. However, that just leads us to the next problem. The image was synced on one axis, but not on the other. I tried adjusting the pots on the monitor, but I couldn't get the image to stabilize. I even tried some different tricks with the wiring, all to no avail, so I did some research. There's a really informative article by Bob Roberts that explains the various different kinds of syncs that different brands of monitors will use. Basically, some games used a positive sync split into a horizontal and vertical signal that would be input on the same connector as the RGB video signals. But the Class of 81 PCB uses a composite negative sync signal. So not only does it need to be ran to a separate input, but on a separate connector, and the composite signal needs to be looped together to both the horizontal and vertical pins. Thankfully, I still had some pins on that old connector that I had cut, so I made my new connector and wired everything in. After that, the image was stable, but there was a massive curl at the edge of the screen. I twiddled all the various potentiometers on the monitor, but nothing would clear this up, so I decided to worry about it later. Pressing forward, I connected all the different wires from the JAMMA harness to all the different parts of the cabinet. The harness is labeled and all the wires are color-coded pretty well, so it's a relatively easy process. But one word of advice is to make sure you don't tighten down your zip ties until you are 100% done, because I had to go back and add wires multiple times, and I either had to cut these zip ties or try to fit the new wires underneath them. I eventually got to the coin meter, which is something that I like to have hooked up. That way I can count how many times I've played a game since I've owned it. But this ended up giving me a lot of issues. I had initially connected it to both of the coin meter connections on the JAMMA harness, but when I inserted a coin, nothing happened. Then I realized that this was probably for two separate coin meters, so I just need to run the other line to ground, since with all of the switches, the named line just passes through the component and then back to ground. But after finding a Class of 81 wiring diagram, I found out that the meter connection itself is a ground, and you can connect the other end of the meter to either 5 or 12 volts, depending on what your meter needs. I tested this with a loose wire beforehand, and yep, it works. And that ended up being one of those extra wires I was talking about. So now that everything else is hooked up and working the way it should, I decided to temporarily connect the harness to the original Galaga control panel while I waited for my new panel to arrive. That way, at the very least, I'd have a working Galaga again. That leads us back to that monitor curl from earlier. I was thinking that, potentially, this was always an issue with this monitor. It just wasn't noticeable on Galaga. But looking back at the old footage from the episode that I did, there's no curl to speak of. So I started doing some research again. Turns out, G07 monitors do not handle negative sync very well. And as I stated earlier, the Class of 81 PCB uses a composited negative sync signal. Thankfully, there are a couple of mods you can do to fix this, so I removed the monitor chassis and got back to work.
Forgot to turn this on.
To fix the sync issue, you must remove the capacitor at C501. Then, remove the capacitor at C303 and put it in C501's place. And don't worry, polarity does not matter with these particular capacitors. In the empty space C303 left behind, you have to install a 10 to 22 microfarad 25 volt minimum capacitor in this specific orientation. Thankfully, after digging through my bag of random spare electronic parts, I did have the exact capacitor for the job. So I soldered everything up and reinstalled the monitor. I would say that this mod fixed about 95% of the issue. The image is perfectly straight up top, and mostly there at the bottom, but there is this warping effect that happens shortly after startup. Just to lay this one to bed, I decided to dig deeper and found two other mods that are supposed to assist with syncing a G07 with negative sync. First off, C517 and C518 both need to be 220 microfarads at 25 volts or more, and on my monitor, only one of them was. Thankfully, I also had a spare one of those in my parts bag too. Lastly, it was an apparently common mistake for the factory to install the wrong resistors at R303, 306, 314, and 317. These all need to be 390 ohms, and on my monitor, one of them was not. Thankfully, I was able to scrap one off of my parts G07 that I had laying around. Now the image is maybe a little bit better, but the curl issue is definitely gone. After demagnetizing the monitor, the geometry still isn't perfect, but that could be down to the tube itself at this point, since I've fixed basically everything else that it could be. So now the only thing left is to replace that control panel, since right now I can only start Galaga, since Miss Pac-Man stupidly needs its own start buttons. But even if I could start Miss Pac-Man, I couldn't go up or down. What I really need is a scrap Pac-Man control panel, since that would fit in this cabinet, and after regaining consciousness, I ordered a control panel overlay designed to fit the Class of 81 machine. I used a flashlight to line this up with this scrap Pac-Man control panel that I found on the floor. Unfortunately, the Galaga start buttons would not line up, since this is not for the exact same machine, but I'm going to press on anyways. After lining everything up, and securing it all together with clamps, I used a metal tap to transfer the locations of each of the new buttons onto the control panel. I then drilled a pilot hole for each of these new buttons, and tried to cut them out using my Harbor Freight stepper bit, but that didn't work. Thankfully, my hole saw did, which is good because I'm all out of half saws. For the holes that I'd already drilled out too large, I used a sawhorse to keep the blade centered. The next thing I've got to do is remove the remnants of this old control panel overlay. That way I can put on a new one. So after removing all of the hardware, I bought this. It's a rigid scraper attachment for the oscillating multi-tool, which is something that I use for everything. This is definitely the easiest way to remove old control panel overlays, and I can't recommend this method enough.
I can't live. Living is without you. Can't give. I can't give anymore. I can't live.
I then used a combination of acetone, complaining,
Oh, I got it on my socks.
scraping, and sanding to get the old glue off of the control panel. After that, I shot it with 2 coats of high gloss black spray paint, and then it was ready for the new overlay. I lined the overlay up using the same light technique again. Then I clamped everything into place, cut out the holes, and temporarily installed buttons on one side to hold the overlay in position. I then removed the clamps from one side, folded it back, removed the paper backing, and slowly and gently applied the overlay from the middle out towards the edge, with the buttons and clamps assuring that the panel remained securely lined up. Then I swapped everything over and did the same thing to the other side. The hardest part was definitely the bend. I used my heat gun to gently coax the material to bend smoothly, then worked my way from one side to the other, trying to avoid getting any air trapped under the material. I did the same thing for the bends around the edges. After cutting the excess material off of the side, the panel was ready to be installed. Or so I thought. Turns out, this latch is in the way. Apparently, the Miss Pac-Man control panel uses a longer hook than the Galaga one, so I measured the Galaga one and cut the Miss Pac-Man one to size. Now the panel is ready to be installed. Thankfully, I had a spare Pac-Man joystick from one of the old cocktail cabinets I worked on in a previous episode, so it was just a matter of wiring everything in and putting it securely into place. Now, I've got all of my favorite games back, but at 1/3 of the space. But oftentimes, convenience comes with a corresponding costly compromise, and this is no exception. This board is just running an emulator, and it's an emulator from 2001, no less, so it's not going to live up to the same standards as something like a modern FPGA solution would. So there are some audio differences on this machine compared to the original 3 that I had. Overall, the audio is a lot more clear and clean sounding. It's not as bass heavy as it once was. And there are some sounds that are just completely messed up. Because of that, some people would consider what I've done to this machine to be the equivalent of bulldozing an old lady's house to build a new Walmart. But you have to consider this from my perspective. I grew up in the early 2000s, where every road trip meant a potential perusal of the nearest Toys R Us and a trip to the mall arcade to try to win those awesome early 2000s Pac-Man stuffed animals from the claw machine, and to play Class of '81. So for me, my original experience with these games was on a Class of '81 machine, so it's actually more directly nostalgic than the original machines. That said, I am very glad that I took the plunge to study and repair the original hardware. It satisfied years of curiosity and taught me a lot of skills that an emulator never could. But now that I've done that, I'm content to carry on playing these games on my new machine for years to come. What I really need is a scrap Pac-Man control panel, since that would fit in this cabinet, and a Class of '81 overlay would... Did that look convincing at all?
You fell.
We're gonna have to do it a couple times.
Yeah, he hardly hit you when you were on the floor. Yeah.
But if I go like this and then you fall this way.
But also, maybe if you go a little bit in front of his face so he can see it in his peripheral vision.
Peripheral?
Yeah.
Oh wait, there's a mirror right there in that display case. Okay.
Bam!
Okay, yep. Alright.
Take 2.
Take 2. But even if I could start Miss Pac-Man, I couldn't go up or down. What I really need is a scrap Pac-Man control panel, since that would fit in this cabinet, and a... Ah!
I think I was better.
I think I laughed too.
You did.
I'm sorry.
You dropped your
Quiet.
phone.
Yeah.
And I need a new phone.
You're already
I
dead.
need a new wife that doesn't laugh.
I'm not gonna laugh, sorry.
I'm just
Promise.
kidding.
Got it out.
Do I look like I've fallen on the ground 3 times?
Yeah. Get on your side. Yeah. Okay. That's good.
Okay.
Don't be quiet now.
I feel like there's a hole in my pants now. Oh, there is.
Is there really?
There's a hole
You
in
ripped
my
your
pants.
pants?
Yeah.
Did you really?
Yes. Yes. So, let's do another take.
Okay.
And then I'll go change my pants.